দর্শক আপনাদের সবাইকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি আমাদের আজকের অনুষ্ঠানে। আমাদের আজকের অনুষ্ঠানে আমরা যুক্তরাষ্ট্র এবং চীনের মধ্যেকার বর্তমান সম্পর্ক নিয়ে কথা বলবো। ভয়েস অফ আমেরিকার ন্যাশনাল সিকিউরিটি করেসপন্ডেন্ট জেফ সেলডিনের সাথে। Jeff Seldin, how are you doing? Welcome to our show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We know that there is a tension going on between the US and China for a long time. But recently, there was a meeting in Zurich between the senior Chinese foreign policy advisor and White House National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. On principle, they have agreed that there will be a virtual summit between President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping by the end of the year. In the light of this, we know that China has been growing their military influence in the region. What kind of information do you have so far on that?
Well, there are several things that have happened recently that have really brought the tensions between the United States and Beijing to the forefront. First, in recent days and recent weeks, there have been numerous incursions by the Chinese Air Force into Taiwanese airspace, and that's an area of friction. There was a report that came out that indicated that the U.S. had special forces troops and some Marines in Taiwan to do training just in case something happened, just in case there was an attack from China. So that's one thing. Another thing that happened is that the U.S. spy agency, the top spy agency, the CIA, announced recently that it was setting up a new China Mission Center to better focus its efforts on combating and confronting China's efforts across the globe. The CIA director called China the most important geopolitical threat that the United States is facing in the 21st century. He also called it the confrontation with China, the tensions with China, the toughest geopolitical test. And then, of course, there's ongoing concerns that officials and U.S. lawmakers have voiced repeatedly about what China does in the cyber realm in terms of hacking and getting into systems and gathering information. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, recently said that because of Chinese activities, it is opening up what it calls a new counterintelligence investigation on average every 12 hours. So there's a huge focus on China. The Pentagon calls it the pacing threat. The intelligence community is calling it a tough geopolitical test. And that's really the framework in which these discussions, these diplomatic discussions between the White House and Beijing are starting to take place. And there is a lot of concern that there's little room for error because of a miscalculation, and then things could go south, could go bad very quickly.
So the United States have been facing the cyber security threat, not only from Russia. Now China is another big threat for the United States.
Yes, and it's interesting to hear how U.S. officials talk about the threat from China as opposed to the threat from Russia. With Russia, there seems to be more of an attempt, according to U.S. officials, to divide the population, to play on doubts and divisions within U.S. society. There's been some of that from China, but for the most part, officials say of late, China has been really focused on infiltrating systems to gather intelligence. And this is happening in the U.S., but companies like Microsoft, the tech company, just came out with a report recently saying that China's been doing this a lot, especially in its part of the world, in gathering what it called social, economic, and political intelligence from countries like India, Malaysia, Mongolia, Pakistan, Thailand. So they're very active there. They've also become more active in Central and South America, something U.S. military officials have worried about as well. So there's a confrontation and there's a need to confront and play this great power competition out with China, both near China in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, but also much closer to home. So that makes the interactions more fraught and more complicated.
In recent times, there is a little bit of tension between the United States of America and France. And that's because United States and Britain, they are having some military give and take with Australia.
There seems to be the U.S. for a while has been talking to its allies, both in the Indo-Pacific and further afield, including allies that are part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which are mostly allies in Europe, about the need to look at China. NATO doesn't border on China, but with technology and Chinese technology being prevalent everywhere and being used everywhere and available and sold everywhere, it's becoming more and more of a challenge, especially because some of the Chinese companies are offering their technology at very competitive prices. And it makes it attractive to countries when they want to invest in technology like 5G. So the U.S. has been pushing this, and the U.S. Has been seeing, and U.S. officials say they're seeing more of a receptivity from their allies, like Britain, like Australia, to take additional measures, whether that means it's in the economic realm, in the intelligence realm, or in the case of the deal between the U.S., Britain, and Australia, in the military realm, to provide more pushback, more of a show of force, and provide more capabilities should China decide to get even more aggressive than what it is now.
China is a big power in the Asian region, and of course, South Asian countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. They have a strong relationship with the United States. At the same time, they are closer to China geographically. So it is also important for them to have a relationship with China. In that context, how important is the South Asian countries' relationship with the United States?
The United States, the message that intelligence officials, military officials tend to give to countries in the region is that there's an understanding that those countries need to have a relationship with China. It's unavoidable. At the same time, though, the U.S. officials seem to try to tell and try to warn these countries that it's necessary to be close to China. It can be dangerous to be too close to China. And they point to the way China has operated in places like Africa, in places like Central and South America, the way it's rolled out its Belt and Road Initiative, which often brings tantalizing benefits up front to the countries that sign on. But over the long term, those countries end up owing China a lot of money and find themselves really blocked into certain situations where they have very few choices. They either have to go the way that Beijing wants them to go, make decisions that are favorable to Beijing, or they wind up in more financial trouble. And so the U.S. tends to really plays that up and warns countries about that. And as a result, it tries to pitch these countries on a closer relationship with Washington, saying that Washington can be a better friend, a better ally, and that when it comes to self-determination and the ability to make decisions that are good for those countries will be able to do that much more successfully if they side more with Washington than they do with China.
The previous administration, the Trump administration, had a tense relationship with China during Trump's time. Do you think President Biden will be able to ease that tension a little bit?
The styles of communication between the Trump administration with China and the Biden administration with China on the surface seem to be different. Trump at times could be very confrontational. Some might describe him as bombastic in the way that he would go out and make comments directed at China. But when you look behind the scenes, when you dig a little bit deeper, the policies when it comes to the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence community, the concerns that they have, and the urge at various levels of the U.S. government for Washington to take a tough stance on China, an increasingly tough stance on China, that has remained pretty much constant. So what remains to be seen is how these dynamics will play out in talks between President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. How is that going to affect the relationship going forward? How is that going to impact potential negotiations on arms control, something that is very important to the U.S., on economic discussions and economic fair play that is important to the U.S. So that's what will have to play itself out. So in some ways, while the tenor of the discussion, the tenor of the talk from Washington may have changed, the underlying concerns have been constant and they remain very much high.
Jeff, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
দর্শক, আপনাদের ফিরিয়ে নিয়ে যাচ্ছি ঢাকায় RTV স্টুডিওতে। এতক্ষণ আমি কথা বললাম ভয়েস অব আমেরিকার ন্যাশনাল সিকিউরিটি করেসপন্ডেন্ট জেফ সেলডিনের সাথে। আশা করি সাক্ষাৎকারটি আপনারা উপভোগ করেছেন। সবাই নিরাপদে থাকুন।